There's a question that has quietly unsettled Hollywood, and perhaps even lingered in the minds of millions watching from their living rooms. How does someone who built an empire around the simple message, "Be kind," end up being described, by those closest to the production, as cold, distant, even intimidating? And more importantly, how does a show that dominated daytime television for nearly 2 decades suddenly collapse, not because of ratings, but because of reputation? This isn't just a celebrity story. It's a story about perception, power, and the fragile line between what we are told to believe and what might actually be true. So before we go any further, ask yourself this. How often do we accept a public image without ever questioning what might exist behind it? The rise of a kindness icon. Long before the fame, before the awards, before the carefully crafted persona, Ellen DeGeneres was simply someone trying to find her place in the world. Born in 1958 in Louisiana, her early life was far from glamorous. She grew up in a modest household, navigating the same uncertainties that millions of ordinary people face. There were no guarantees, no shortcuts, just determination. Before stepping onto a stage, she worked a variety of everyday jobs. She waited tables, sold vacuum cleaners door to door, painted houses. Each role gave her something subtle but powerful, an understanding of people. She learned how to read expressions, how to sense discomfort, how to make someone laugh when they least expected it. But here's something worth thinking about. Do the struggles that shape us early in life stay with us, or do they slowly fade as power replaces vulnerability? By the early 1980s, Ellen found her calling in stand-up comedy. Her style was observational, relatable, and disarmingly simple. She didn't rely on shock value. She relied on timing, delivery, and authenticity. And then came 1986. A moment that would quietly redefine her career. After a standout performance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, she was invited to sit on the couch, a rare honor at the time. That invitation wasn't just symbolic. It was a signal. She had arrived. Hollywood had noticed. But success rarely follows a straight path. And for Ellen, the most defining and controversial moment was still ahead. The moment that changed everything. In 1997, at the height of her sitcom success, Ellen made a decision that would reshape not only her career, but television history. She came out as gay. At a time when representation was limited and acceptance was far from guaranteed, this was more than a personal revelation. It was a public statement. The episode of her sitcom where her character came out drew massive attention. Millions watched. But what followed wasn't just support, it was backlash. Advertisers pulled out. Ratings became unstable. And eventually, the show was cancelled. Almost overnight, Ellen went from being a rising star to someone Hollywood wasn't sure how to handle. Opportunities disappeared. Endorsements faded. The industry that once embraced her grew distant. So here's the uncomfortable question. When someone experiences that level of rejection and isolation, does it change who they are? Or does it change how they present themselves to survive? Because sometimes, reinvention isn't a choice. It's a necessity. Reinvention and the birth of a brand. By the early 2000s, Ellen DeGeneres was ready for a comeback. But this time, she returned with something different. Something carefully constructed. In 2003, The Ellen DeGeneres Show premiered. It wasn't just another talk show. It was an experience, bright, upbeat, emotionally engaging. It avoided confrontation and controversy, focusing instead on laughter, positivity, and connection. And at the center of it all was a message repeated so often it became inseparable from her identity. Be kind to one another. It was simple. It was memorable. And it worked. Audiences didn't just watch the show, they felt it. They saw surprise giveaways, emotional reunions, and life-changing acts of generosity. People laughed. They cried. They shared clips. For many, Ellen became more than a host. She became a symbol. But let's pause here for a moment. When kindness becomes a performance, repeated daily, broadcast globally, does it remain genuine, or does it evolve into something else? Because over time, the message of kindness became more than a closing line. It became a brand. The power behind the persona. At her peak, Ellen wasn't just influential, she was powerful. Her show became a cultural platform where careers could be launched overnight. Unknown artists went viral. Celebrities rebranded themselves. Viral moments turned into global conversations. Being invited onto her show wasn't just exposure, it was validation. But with that level of influence came something else. Control. And control, in any environment, often changes how people behave. Behind the scenes, the dynamic wasn't always visible to the public. But within any powerful system, there are always unspoken rules. People become cautious. They measure their words. They adapt. So ask yourself, when someone holds that much influence, how many people around them feel comfortable speaking honestly? Because sometimes, silence says more than words ever could. The moments that felt different. At first, the cracks didn't appear as scandals. They appeared as moments. Small, subtle interactions that, on the surface, seemed harmless. Even entertaining. But over time, when revisited, they began to feel different. Take the interview with Taylor Swift. What was framed as a playful segment slowly turned into persistent questioning about her personal relationships. Despite visible discomfort, the questions continued. The audience laughed. But did everyone feel comfortable? Or consider the moment with Dakota Johnson. A joke about not being invited to a birthday party quickly unraveled when Dakota calmly corrected Ellen on air. The tension was brief, but noticeable. For a split second, the dynamic shifted. And then there was Mariah Carey. In what was meant to be a light-hearted moment, she was pressured into addressing pregnancy rumors by drinking champagne. Years later, when it became known she had suffered a miscarriage around that time, the clip took on a far more serious tone. Suddenly, it didn't feel funny anymore. It felt uncomfortable. So here's the question. How many moments like this were dismissed as entertainment? Simply because they made people laugh. When whispers became voices. For years, these moments remained isolated. They were discussed, shared, debated, but never fully connected. Until 2020. That's when everything changed. It began, as many modern stories do, online. A single tweet invited people to share their experiences working on the Ellen DeGeneres Show. What followed wasn't one story, but many. Dozens. Then hundreds. Former employees described a workplace environment that didn't align with the public image of kindness. They spoke of fear, pressure, and a culture where speaking up wasn't always safe. The contrast was striking. On screen, warmth, generosity, joy. Behind the scenes, a very different narrative. Warner Media launched an internal investigation. Executives were removed. Apologies were issued. And Ellen herself addressed the situation publicly, acknowledging that the show had fallen short of its values. But by then, something had already shifted. Trust. Once broken, it's not easily repaired. So ask yourself, is it possible to separate a public persona from private behavior, or do they inevitably collide? The beginning of the end. After nearly 2 decades of success, the Ellen DeGeneres Show announced its final season. The decision wasn't framed as a direct result of controversy, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Ratings declined. Public perception shifted. And the show that once defined daytime television quietly prepared to close its chapter. The final episodes carried a sense of reflection, gratitude, closure, but also questions. Unanswered ones. Because for many viewers, the ending wasn't just about a show going off the air. It was about something deeper. A realization that the images we trust, the personas we admire, may not always tell the full story. The bigger picture. This story isn't just about Ellen DeGeneres. It's about something much larger. It's about how easily perception can be shaped. How powerful a narrative can become when it's repeated often enough. And how difficult it is to reconcile 2 conflicting realities, the one we see, and the one we don't. What does kindness really mean when it's placed under the spotlight? Is it something that lives quietly in everyday actions, invisible and uncelebrated? Or is it something that can be shaped, refined, and presented, almost like a performance, when millions are watching? At first glance, the answer feels simple. Kindness should be genuine, effortless, natural. But the moment you introduce fame, influence, and the expectations of an audience, everything begins to blur. Because in a world where perception can be carefully controlled, even something as pure as kindness can become complicated. And maybe that's exactly why this story continues to linger. Not because it gives us certainty, but because it leaves us questioning everything we thought we understood. The illusion of consistency. For years, audiences believed they knew exactly what kindness looked like. It had a face, a voice, a tone. It laughed, danced, and reminded people daily to be kind. That message became more than a phrase, it became a brand. And when a message is repeated often enough, it starts to feel like truth. But here's something worth asking. Can a message, no matter how positive, become a mask? Because consistency on camera doesn't always guarantee consistency behind it. And that's where the first cracks often begin, not in what we see, but in what we don't. The power of image. Hollywood has always been a place where identities are crafted. Carefully. Deliberately. Public figures aren't just known for their work, they're known for who they appear to be. And as Katt Williams has suggested in various interviews, the industry often functions like a machine. A system where personalities are shaped into something marketable. Not necessarily fake, but refined, enhanced, simplified into something audiences can instantly understand. Fine. Funny. Relatable. Safe. But real people are rarely that simple. So what happens when a human being is expected to live up to a version of themselves that was never entirely real to begin with? Is it sustainable? Or is it only a matter of time before reality begins to surface? 2020, when silence broke. For a long time, there were whispers. Small stories. Isolated claims. Moments that didn't quite fit the narrative, but weren't strong enough to challenge it either. And then, in 2020, something changed. The voices didn't just increase. They aligned. This time, the stories weren't coming from distant observers or outside critics. They came from people who had been there, employees, staff members, individuals who worked behind the scenes. The ones no one usually sees. And what they described painted a very different picture. A workplace that felt tense rather than welcoming. An environment where fear replaced comfort. Stories of employees feeling overlooked, dismissed, or even punished for situations beyond their control. Some accounts went further, raising serious concerns about discrimination, inappropriate conduct, and a culture that seemed to contradict everything the public had come to associate with the show. And that raises a question that's difficult to ignore. When one person speaks out, it might be dismissed. When many people share similar experiences, what does that mean? Is it coincidence, miscommunication, or something deeper? The weight of repetition. Patterns are powerful. One complaint can be explained away. Two might raise suspicion. But when multiple individuals, independent of one another, describe the same kind of experience, it becomes harder to ignore. Because repetition creates credibility. And credibility demands attention. The conversation shifted almost overnight. What had once been an untouchable image suddenly became a subject of scrutiny. People began to look back, revisiting old clips, interviews, moments that once felt harmless. And now, with new context, those same moments started to feel different. Uncomfortable, even. Which leads to another unsettling thought. How many things do we overlook in real time, only to recognize them years later? The response. The reaction was immediate. An internal investigation was launched. Producers were removed. Statements were issued. And at the center of it all was Ellen DeGeneres, addressing the controversy directly. She acknowledged the situation, expressing disappointment and taking responsibility, while also stating that she hadn't been fully aware of everything happening behind the scenes. But that explanation introduced a question that many found difficult to reconcile. How can someone lead a show for nearly 2 decades and not fully understand the environment within it? Is it possible? Maybe. Large systems often develop layers. Communication can become filtered. Problems can be hidden before they reach the top. But at the same time, leadership carries responsibility. Not just for what is seen, but for what is allowed to exist. So where does accountability begin, and where does it end? A shift in perspective. For viewers, the impact went beyond the allegations themselves. It wasn't just about what happened. It was about contrast. The gap between what was presented and what was described. Because people didn't just watch the show for entertainment. They trusted it. They believed in the message. And when that belief is shaken, the reaction becomes emotional. Not just disappointment, but confusion. Because it forces people to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if the version of someone we admire isn't the full picture? A different example. Now consider someone like Keanu Reeves. Interestingly, he rarely speaks about kindness. He doesn't promote it as a defining part of his identity. There's no slogan attached to his public image. And yet, story after story continues to emerge. Quiet ones. Small, almost insignificant at first glance. Giving up his seat on a crowded train. Donating large portions of his earnings to crew members. Living a life that seems unusually grounded, despite immense success. These aren't moments designed for attention. They're often revealed by others, sometimes years later. And that raises an important comparison. Which feels more genuine? Kindness that is consistently spoken about, or kindness that exists quietly, without announcement? Performance versus reality. This isn't about labeling one person as good or bad. It's about understanding the difference between performance and reality. Because in many ways, all public figures perform. They step into a role, whether on screen, on stage, or even in interviews. The challenge arises when that role becomes inseparable from who they are expected to be. Because maintaining an image, especially one built around something as emotionally charged as kindness, requires constant reinforcement. And that pressure can be immense. So here's a question worth considering. Can anyone truly live up to a perfect image, every single day, without exception? Or is imperfection inevitable? The end of an era. By 2022, the show came to an end. Not abruptly, but with a sense of closure that felt different from what many had once imagined. It wasn't just a finale. It was a moment of reflection. For some, the Ellen DeGeneres Show would always represent joy, laughter, and groundbreaking moments in television. For others, it became a reminder of how complicated public personas can be. And maybe both perspectives are valid. Because people, and their legacies, are rarely defined by a single narrative. Can both things be true? This is where the story becomes truly complex. Is it possible for someone to have brought happiness to millions, and still have contributed to an environment that others found difficult? Can both realities exist at the same time? The instinct is to choose one side. To simplify. To decide. But real life doesn't always offer that clarity. Sometimes, the truth exists in contradiction. And maybe that's what makes it so difficult to accept. The attempt at return. In the years that followed, there were attempts to move forward. Stand-up performances. Public appearances. Moments of humor that acknowledged the controversy. But rebuilding trust is not the same as earning it. Once people begin to question something deeply, reassurance alone isn't always enough. Because trust isn't just about words. It's about consistency over time. And even then, it may never fully return to what it once was. The bigger question. At its core, this isn't just a story about one show or one person. It's about perception. About how easily it can be shaped. How strongly it can influence belief. And how difficult it can be to challenge once it's established. It's about the gap between what we see and what exists beyond the frame. And most importantly, it's about us. Because as audiences, we play a role too. We choose what to believe. We decide who to trust. We often accept narratives without questioning how they're constructed. So here's something worth asking. Do we sometimes prefer the illusion? Because it's easier, more comforting, less complicated. Kindness, redefined. Maybe the real lesson here isn't about proving whether someone is kind or not. Maybe it's about redefining what kindness actually means. Is it a message? A reputation? A carefully maintained image? Or is it something quieter? Something that exists even when no one is watching. When there are no cameras, no audience, no expectations. Because if kindness only appears when it's visible, is it still kindness? The final reflection. In the end, this story doesn't offer a clear conclusion. It doesn't tell you exactly what to believe. And maybe that's intentional. Because the most powerful stories aren't the ones that provide answers. They're the ones that leave you thinking long after they're over. So let's come back to where we started. What does kindness really mean? Is it something we show the world? Or something we practice in private? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all. How many other stories, perfect on the surface, are hiding something far more complicated underneath? Because if this story has taught us anything, it's that the truth is rarely as simple as it seems.